Everybody, and hello from London. Welcome to this Global Government Forum webinar looking at how the US federal government can evaluate its performance. My name is Richard Johnson. I'm the executive editor of Global Government Forum, a media company that is focused on bringing together public and civil servants to share best practice. And we are joined by SAS as today's knowledge partner for our webinar. And it is a webinar on a very pertinent topic. The federal government in the United States is required in law to enhance efforts to develop and use performance information and other evidence in decision-making. And as if to underline the imperative, the Biden-Harris administration launched in April a year of evidence for action that is focused on mobilizing research-based evidence in policymaking to make life healthier, safer, more equitable, and more prosperous for the American public. The administration is focused on three priorities that I thought were interesting to share to set the scene for today's webinar: sharing leading practices from federal agencies to generate and use research-backed knowledge to advance better, more equitable outcomes for all of America, strengthening and developing new strategies and structures to promote consistent evidence-based decision-making inside the federal government, and increasing connections and collaboration among researchers, knowledge producers, and decision makers inside and outside of government. And it is definitely in that spirit that we at Global Government Forum bring together this panel today. And it's a pleasure to welcome everybody to this event. I will introduce our panel in a moment, but first I just want to encourage everybody who is watching along to get in touch and share your knowledge and expertise too. Do you have good examples of using evidence in policy? Are there barriers that you have overcome to help ensure that evidence can properly influence decisions? Or are you indeed facing those barriers now? And would you like thoughts from our panel on how they can be resolved? Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to make any submissions to the panel, and we have plenty of time in today's session to get to questions. So yes, please, as many comments and contributions as possible. And as I say, it is a great panel that we have got, so let me introduce them now. First up, we have Annie Chang, the Deputy Evaluation Officer and Organizational Performance Lead at the US Department of Treasury. Annie leads a team that is responsible for the coordination and development of the department's strategic plan, and she and her team are responsible for coordinating program management, improvement efforts, and the implementation of Title I of the Foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. So it's great to have Annie here today. Prior to joining the Department of the Treasury, Annie held positions in the US Department of Health and Human Services at the Centers for Medicine and Medicaid Services. So welcome, Annie. Next up, we have Jason R. Bosse, the Director of Program Performance Analysis and Evaluation at the US Small Business Administration. Jason leads a professional staff in the implementation of the Government Performance and Results Modernization Act, the Program Management Improvement Accountability Act, and the Foundations of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act. Jason has also held positions designing and implementing performance management systems across other federal, state, and local government agencies, including the US Environmental Protection Agency, and is also an Excellence in Government Fellow through the Partnership for Public Services. So welcome, Jason. Next, I want to introduce Kathleen Nestor, the Managing Director at SAS. Kathleen is the Managing Director at SAS's civilian practice, helping several US federal agencies accomplish their missions with the use of data and advanced analytics. Kathleen has guided agencies in their efforts to comply with the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act and has worked with many agencies across the civilian landscape, including the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Department of the Interior, the US Census Bureau, and Department for Transportation, among others. Before joining SAS, Kathleen worked as a statistician for the Department of Commerce. So it's great to have you here, Kathleen. Next on our panel, we have Winston J. Allen, the Agency Evaluation Officer from US Agency for International Development. Winston leads the coordination, development and implementation of the plans required under Title I of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, including the Learning Agenda Evidence Building Plan, the Annual Evaluation Plan, and the Capacity Assessment. He also leads the efforts of USAID to strengthen evaluation, practice and capacity by providing technical support in impact and performance evaluation designs. Overall, he has over 30 years of experience in international development program monitoring and evaluation and project planning and design, cutting across sectors including economic growth, health, transportation, labour, education, architecture, business and natural resource management. So welcome, Winston. And our final panelist today is Christine Heflin, the Evaluation Officer at the Department of Commerce. Christine coordinates the development of the department's strategic plan and OMB required reporting on plan implementation, and is also the co-lead of the development of the department's 2022 to 2026 strategic plan and the aligned learning agenda and evaluation capacity assessment. Christine served as examiner for the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Programme and was the city's internal consultant when Coral Springs in Florida became the first government to win the prestigious Baldrige Award for Performance Excellence. And as a consultant to NATO, Christine developed the organisation's system of balanced scorecards. And additionally, she has served as the Director of Budget and Research in Prima County, Arizona. So welcome, Christine, and it's great to have all of our panelists here today. We're going to hear some opening comments from each of them before we get into the question and answer session. And just to reiterate, please do submit questions to us. But I'm going to ask Annie to speak first about her thoughts on evaluation. Annie.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm really happy to be here today. Thank you, Richard, for the really kind opening remarks. Like Richard said, my name is Annie Chang. I serve as the Deputy Evaluation Officer for the U.S. Department of Treasury. I also serve as the Organizational Performance Lead for the department. And I think because of where I sit in the organization, I have a very interesting, I would say, take on how we are implementing the Foundation's Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2019. We'll shorten this to say Evidence Act specifically. And since I'm going first, I'll maybe give you a little bit of context to those who aren't familiar with the law, that at the heart of the law, it intends the government to better integrate evidence, data and information to inform decision-making. And a lot of it is to ensure that the decision we're making that will affect lots and lots of people are sound as best as we can using information that's out there. There's a set of requirements that includes requiring agencies to assess our evidence building capacity. It also requires us to think about what we want to learn. So setting ourselves up for a 4-year learning agenda and a plan to execute some of those items, which is inclusive of research. And then there are, among other things that we do in Title II and III, which are some of the components of data, statistics, et cetera, that is also part of the law. Today, I want to share a little bit with how Treasury is maybe in an untraditional way thinking about implementing this law specifically, and then connecting to what Richard was saying about the Biden and Harris administration's second priority for this area was seeing how we can make structures that enables good decision-making and better informed decision-making. And so just a little bit of background too. My background is in public health, and before coming to Treasury, I was very interested in using data information to do good policymaking in that arena. And when I came to Treasury, one of the interesting things that I quickly learned is that no matter how good your research is, and no matter how good your evidence is there. Now, we're not talking about access issues, we're talking about readily available. Imagine that it's flowing directly to a decision maker. If we do not have a good understanding of the decision-making models that we have, and understanding how it is really getting the right type of information into the right windows of opportunity in the right meetings, our evidence that we are painstakingly hoping to create and generate, use in a way that will inform better decision-making. And I like to say that when I was applying for my doctorate at Johns Hopkins University, one of the reasons maybe why they accepted me is because in the personal statement, I explicitly say that I wanted to be a connector to academics, into research, into evidence for that translation of that information where it would matter into decision making. And I think I'm spending a lot of time in my dissertation looking into decision models and what that looks like, especially in times of uncertainty. So I think all of it here is to say is that in my opening remarks, I wanted to give highlight to the management routines that are at agencies, potentially at your organization, no matter what level, to be the foundations of how this information is going to get carried forward to be used. When I say organizational management routines, these could be stemming from the ways in which leaders at your organization is looking into assessing performance. At Treasury right now, we are hoping to really stir the conversation and not only looking at organizational performance, but organizational health, right? And I think we're defining in the 3 dimensions of performance, organizational capacity, how you're going to carry out this mission, and organizational resiliency. So ensuring that you're understanding your change load and your stressors of, especially very relevant in this time of pandemic, what those look like and the health of your organization in general. And we want to infuse that process with evidence and data and specific organizations of that information that will be the most helpful when the decision maker is in the room, hoping to make some decision that will affect a lot of people. And so we thought about going back to using organizational routines as a really big foundation to maybe be, I would say, the vehicle so that we could deliver this evidence. Now, Treasury, I would say that, along with some agencies in the federal government, we are all at very different maturities in terms of our generation of evidence itself. And so understanding that Treasury perhaps is not a traditional way, I would say, in developing evidence. So meaning that our main mission is not to generate research papers or have readily out of one of our bureaus or business units hundreds and hundreds of researchers ready and are making a lot of contributions either to academics or papers, et cetera. And so we find ourselves, like a lot of federal agencies who are speaking into the policy realm and generating potentially regulations or monitoring risk and challenges that we see in the financial sector for Treasury at least. How are we really positioning ourselves to, when we do have that evidence readily, flowing into a way that we could use it most effectively? And where I'm sitting in the organization, dealing with a strategic plan and using that as a framework to focus, I will say, some of our learning on a 4-year basis, I think is the way in which we integrate evidence, at least into the driving of this mission critical and strategic objectives that we want to achieve. And so my other panelists are going to talk about maybe more towards the generation of evidence and the best practices of how they got that set of evidence to be used effectively at the agency. Sharing a little bit what Treasury do, we look into quarterly performances where at our heart of it, identifying major, I would say, thematic areas in each of the seasons. So what we want to do in the summer versus the spring versus the winter versus the fall, ways in which we assess organizational health. And so in the summertime, we talk about budget. So how do we integrate using of data performance a way to identify some of our priorities for the next year in our budget cycle, looking into investments that we provided, are we moving forward with those? And then in the fall time, we look very much slowly on performance, resiliency, and capacity. So all things together, are we setting ourselves up for the new fiscal year to be able to achieve our mission goals and our strategic plan? And so in those instances where we're assessing progress, are our performance measures solid enough? Are they are they at the right key performance indicators to be able to generate that snapshot of where things are, so the decision makers, when they identify risk and challenges, be able to use that in a very informative manner. And then in the wintertime, we look at our strategic plan and infusing the learning agenda itself to figure out, are we ensuring that in the gap areas that we don't know that could help support our mission critical areas, are we learning enough, and are we having the right plan to ensure that we're getting information in the right places? And then finally, in the springtime, we do a cross-sectional area of discussion of topics generated from this winter time of the challenges that we see that are potentially blocking our efforts in our strategic plan. What are those areas that we should identify and mitigate on an enterprise level potentially? All along those lines of the 4 seasons, evidence is a very big portion of it. And I think having the right setup to funnel that information as we generate this evidence is critical to our success in this routine way to check on organizational health. So with that, I know my time is up, and I'll go ahead and maybe stop there. Happy to take any questions on my opening remarks. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Annie. I think that's a really good starting point for our conversation about how organizations have to think about making sure that they've got that flow of evidence into decision making. And I love the seasonal approach. That sounds like something that that could be adopted in lots of different organizations as a way to kind of focus those efforts. I really, really like that. It's a great contribution to start us with. Thank you very much. I'm going to go now to Jason for some opening reflections. Jason.
Thank you, Richard, for the introduction. I'm excited to be here today and welcome everybody to this panel session. I wanted to talk through an example, and similar to Annie, I serve as the agency's evaluation officer as well as the Deputy Performance Improvement Officer. I think that with the SBA, the benefits for our organization is we do try to combine performance and evaluation quite well, which helps us drive evidence-based decision-making. So I'm going to talk through an example to demonstrate how we've done that through some recent evaluations and how we've been able to link that to performance. At the SBA, just to provide some context, we're a mid-sized federal agency. We have about 9,000 federal employees, and we have about $1 billion annual budget. And we have a very centralized function, at least for our office, where we provide support through core functions. Many people are familiar with SBA's loan programs, where we provide loans to businesses who are starting up, but we also provide support to federal contracts to make sure that federal contracts are going to small businesses. We also provide disaster relief to businesses recovering from a disaster. And we also support counseling and training programs through several grant level initiatives to states and nonprofit entities to deliver counseling and training to small businesses. So we have a wide array of services we provide to small businesses across the country. Now, I mentioned earlier, we connect performance management and program evaluation and evidence building. Annie highlighted the Evidence Act and a lot of the principles that stem from the Evidence Act that came out a couple of years ago. The other important act is the Government Performance Results Modernization Act, which sets up our performance management processes, including the strategic plan, as well as our quarterly performance reviews we have with senior leadership and other reporting and planning mechanisms. So the example I was going to bring up is a recent example with our disaster assistance program, which I mentioned. We provide disaster assistance loans to small businesses recovering from disasters. And in our most recent strategic plan, which we just published, which outlines the administration's priorities, we have a goal and objective dedicated to small business disaster relief to help small businesses recover. And as part of that effort, we've identified a priority related to helping to connect back to climate mitigation activities. And for our program, we have a component that allows businesses to take out a portion of the loan to help with mitigation support. So if they wanted to elevate their business to prevent future flooding, that's an example of a mitigation activity. And we established a goal. And so with that goal, we actually built prior research and evaluation work over the past several years to help inform that development of the measure. In the past year, we looked at information related to summary statistics, how many borrowers are taking out the mitigation loan, what are some of the factors that lead to borrowers taking out that mitigation loan, different parts of the country, and understanding the different characteristics about mitigation lending. That evidence helped us to build the baseline for the development of that performance measure and essentially the agency priority goal that stemmed from it. So with that baseline information, we were able to set milestones for what the program managers within that area were going to complete, as well as other activities that they were going to track as part of that priority goal. So it's, again, connecting the evidence, building the evidence, and connecting it back to the priorities in a performance management setting. Now, I did mention the other components that go with the Evidence Act. Annie had mentioned the development of enterprise learning agendas and annual evaluation plans, which stem from the Evidence Act. Those two documents connect back to the strategic plan goals and objectives. So for the SBA, like I mentioned, we have a disaster assistance goal and objective, and we've also have research and evaluation questions as part of our learning agenda and evaluation plan going forward. So now that we have established an agency priority goal, we have prior evidence. Now we want to say what will happen based on our current priority goals. What can we test? And we are testing new initiatives that we will be able to develop new evidence from. So it's cyclical in a way that we've been able to establish evidence, set up a performance measures for it, and test it from that. So with the learning agenda, we've set out new evaluations over the next few years to test those activities, and we'll be able to determine whether certain initiatives are helping to inform or helping to shape the progress towards that goal. So a good example with the mitigation lending that I mentioned, we are training our loan officers on raising awareness for borrowers to help increase the uptake of those loans. So we will be able to test training programs to see whether the loan officers understand mitigation lending, and we'll be able to test whether borrowers understand or are taking up more of those loans as a result. And we'll be able to see that because we track quarterly progress through the agency priority goal. We publish that information on performance.gov. And we also hold other sessions internally to track progress and accountability. A good example of that is, I mentioned earlier, is the quarterly performance reviews, which stem from the GPRA Modernization Act. And so we have senior leadership discussions with our key officials to talk about the priority goal status. We discuss progress towards milestones, performance data, and a whole host of other factors that are impacting progress. So there's an accountability forum as well to tie back to how we've established the priorities and are making sure we're tracking that progress. So that's one example of how the agency, how the Small Business Administration has tied back performance and evidence. We've been able to build an evidence base, connect that back to our organizational goals. So setting up an agency priority goal that's part of our strategic plan. We've been able to link the two together, performance and evaluation, through various mechanisms, including the strategic plan, the enterprise learning agenda, and our quarterly performance reviews. And we've been able to test these results, and we'll see the feedback from evidence building so that we're able to adjust our goals going forward, adjust targets, and then set new goals so that we're able to, again, help more small businesses access resources, and again, through this example, address mitigation activities. So with that, Richard, I'll stop it there so we can go to the next speaker.
That's absolutely fascinating, Jason. A really good kind of step-by-step guide to how you've implemented that and how agencies can go about building the evidence base and linking it back to policy delivery and making that a kind of virtuous cycle as well that can ensure that the goals are kept up to date and matched to the performance. That is a really great example of this kind of work happening on the ground. Thank you very much for that. Next, I'm going to ask Kathleen for her thoughts from SAS's point of view. Hello, Kathleen.
Hello, thanks. Good morning, and thanks to everyone for joining. I'm so excited to be a part of this panel. This is a topic that I'm very passionate about. Ever since first studying statistics back in college, it's always been obvious to me that data and analytics and well-designed statistics should drive a large portion of our decisions. So, after joining the federal government a decade ago as a statistician, I remember just being so excited to apply my methodologies and focus on delivering citizen services that were effectively serving our people. It really was a dream, but I did learn quickly that working in the government can sometimes be frustrating when it comes to innovation and change, right? It's not just red tape either, because I feel like that's kind of a negative term. I think the reality is that, all of these barriers that we face really were developed with good intentions to protect the people that we serve. So while, we're all transitioning to a more evidence-based policymaking paradigm, we're going to face challenges, but I think we also always find a way to overcome those. And not only because the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act or, the Zero Trust Executive Order tells us we have to, but because, as public servants, we all want to ensure that we're doing what's best for the people, and not to mention, our own tax dollars, right? So I think we've come a long way. And, since the Evidence-Based Policymaking Act was signed in 2019, I believe we have now like 90 chief data officers or CDOs across the government agencies. I mean, that is amazing. We now have over 347,000 public data sets centralized in data.gov, also amazing. But we still have a way to go. And I think it's important to remember that it's really a moving goalpost. We can always be more efficient no matter the gains that we've already made year over year. It's cyclical. I think Jason and both Annie kind of mentioned this in the way that they're handling their policies and their data collection as well. I definitely see a lot of agencies collecting data and measuring performance, but my main focus tends to be around, are the actions that we're taking really helping us be more effective and efficient? Are we providing evidence that what we are doing is actually working? It's so important that we involve not only data scientists, but also statisticians to ensure that our efforts are indeed effective. For example, I read one agency's strategic plan for diversity, equity, and inclusion. They had very clear definitions of the challenges and the objectives they wanted to achieve. Things like effectively recruit qualified individuals at all levels with diverse backgrounds and cultivate an inclusive workplace. The metrics identified to measure success included things like number of diversity and inclusion related trainings. And while that's really well intentioned, do we want more trainings? Or do we want to validate that those trainings are creating a more inclusive workplace? Because they can be two different things. So maybe instead of X number of trainings, we want to look at its correlation with the number of, discrimination complaints filed each year. Or maybe the number of individuals hired with diverse backgrounds who remained at that agency for over a year. We could use things like natural language processing to mine, employee survey comments to see if the overall employee sentiment around the topic is statistically changing following these trainings. Other things, we might want to look at are how many trainings are reflecting a decrease in the number of discrimination complaints filed. Can an agency meet their goals by providing just one training per year to hiring managers? Would two produce better results? Is there a point at which, adding additional training is creating little additional effect and that further investment is actually wasteful? I think it's also important to measure success through several metrics and at the very least from other agency strategies and outcomes as an additional perspective. And that's why I think panels like these are so important to hear from other government agencies. Because, if we're only looking at one set of actions and their effects in isolation, we still may not actually be investing in the things that are significantly moving the needle. And I'm going to take you back to your intro to stat class from college for just like one moment to remind us that because two things seem to be correlated doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually causing the other thing, right? So one example is, the number of computer science doctorates awarded in the United States strongly correlates with arcade revenue. Does this mean that if we invest in more arcades, we're going to see a flurry of computer scientists enter the workforce? I think we would all really like that, but probably not the case, right? So this is kind of a silly example, obviously, but sometimes even things that are seemingly related, and we would think intuitively that taking this action would have this effect. It's just not always the case, and it's something that statistics and analytics can help us with. And I think it's important to make sure that we're investing our money where it's actually resulting in the outcomes that we intend, and at the least cost to our taxpayers as well. So finding that optimized balance of actions and investments to results. But again, this is an iterative process, and it's going to be something that we all have to build on year over year. I've also seen agencies collecting a lot more data, which is great. I think it's also important to collect and store the right data, as the goal is to leverage it as a strategic asset, rather than something that just spikes storage costs, especially as we move to the cloud. And I've seen this a lot across government agencies where they're starting to collect all this data so they can make evidence-based decisions, but sometimes there's a lot of duplicate data, and it just increases storage costs unexpectedly. And this is where I think that the chief data officers will have the most impact in ensuring that all of the data that's being used in these agencies is very well governed and accounted for, and that agencies know what inventory they have, how it's being used, reduce those duplicative efforts and the data sets that exist, and of course, make sure that how much you're spending on the storage is appropriate. Last point I want to make is about finding the right people and allowing them to effectively collaborate. The CDO Council Chair, Ted Kalk, recently said, "Data work in government is now cool. Nowhere can contributions have a greater impact, and nowhere can data skills be put to better use." And this is so true, and it is so cool. And when recruiting in the federal government, I think we really need to lean in on that focus and kind of tie into that intrinsic motivation. And once you get the right people on the bus, and creating an environment where we can effectively collaborate and share ideas versus working in silos, is really important to streamline those efforts, reduce redundancies in work and in data, and most importantly, spur that creativity. So to wrap up, I just want to emphasize the importance of actually measuring outcomes rather than just well-intentioned actions, and to continue to push through any of those government-specific barriers that we face, like finding talent, obtaining the right data, and just ensure we're truly making the change that we all want to see that leads to a more effective and efficient government.
Thank you, Kathleen. I think that's a good challenge, in fact, to make sure that the data that's being collected is the right data, that the right information is being collated, and that is being fed back into those processes. And I'm glad to hear that data science is now cool. That's a good thing. I would like to say I was into it before it was cool, but it's good that it's becoming more attractive to a lot of graduates, and you do hear that in other governments as well. There's a former senior civil servant in the UK civil service who, when he was trying to encourage people to join, he said, government is the biggest toy store in the world. If you're into data science, the data that you have available working in government is kind of unsurpassed anywhere else. You won't find it anywhere else. So that's a really interesting point. Winston, I want to come to you now for your opening comments and perspective from the USAID point of view.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Really would like to thank the Global Government Forum for inviting me to participate in this panel. And I look forward to a very productive discussion afterward. I will focus my opening remarks on the use of performance evidence in program decision making. Next slide, please. I'll start with a brief introduction of USAID and how we are organized, and then talk a little bit about performance management plans, performance monitoring, performance evaluations, the use of performance evaluation, and learning from performance data. And then I'll just do some lessons in concluding. Next slide, please. Yeah, USAID is a primary foreign assistance organization, and we are very much decentralized. We work in over 80 countries, and we work in several sectors, including agriculture, education, health, democracy, and governance, and so on. In terms of monitoring, evaluation, and learning, we are, as I mentioned, we're decentralized. but we do have a centralized office for policy guidance and technical assistance. And this office is the Office of Learning, Evaluation, and Research. And that's where I'm located as the agency evaluation officer. And this office is within the Bureau for Policy Planning and Learning. And it is relevant for building and maintaining monitoring, evaluation, and learning capacity across the agency. In addition, we have several bureaus in Washington that also help with developing processes for monitoring, evaluation, and learning, coordination, and evidence sharing, such as organizing webinars, communities of practice, evaluation, synthesis, etc. Next slide, please. So the process of performance evidence really starts with what we refer to as the performance management plan. Every mission, once they've got their country strategy approved, are given 90 days to produce a performance management plan. This performance management plan is a mission-wide tool for planning and managing the process of monitoring strategic progress, program performance, programmatic assumptions, and operational context, as well as evaluating performance and impact and learning and adapting from evidence. Next slide, please. So I'll start with performance monitoring, which is one of the primary sources of data that we use as performance evidence. Performance monitoring itself in the agency is the ongoing and systematic collection of performance indicator data to oversee implementation and understand progress toward measurable results. We do have several standard performance indicators that missions do use, but they also are open or allowed to use what we refer to as custom indicators, as well as other contextual indicators which are monitored as part of the performance monitoring. And the performance monitoring data is used to inform judgments about the outputs and outcomes of the programs as a basis to improve their effectiveness and or inform decisions about current and future programming. The performance is analyzed by comparing actual results achieved against the expected results and targets initially set at the beginning of a strategic project or activity. So when interventions are being implemented for the indicators that I mentioned, the mission sets certain targets in terms of the outputs or even the outcomes, and these are monitored in terms of the data that's collected to see what's the the difference or the extent to which the actual results mirror the targeted results. Next slide, please. And the other source of performance data are what's we call performance evaluations. USAID does have an evaluation policy, which was first established in 2011. And in this policy, evaluations are categorized as impact or performance evaluations, depending on the purpose, evaluation questions, and the corresponding design. Performance evaluations, they do encompass a broad range of evaluation methods, including before and after comparison, but generally lack a rigorously defined counterfactual. So unlike impact evaluations where you have to have a counterfactual, with performance evaluations, there are no counterfactuals. And they are designed to identify accomplishments, performance issues, and constraints in activity implementation. Next slide, please. So also performance evaluation focus on measuring the process towards the achievement of results and how inputs and outputs are producing outcomes. So as a result of performance evaluation, decisions are made on what program activities to continue, modify, or enhance. And also performance evaluation allows for a broader perspective on operations and an effective decision-making tool to inform activity design and implementation. So in the performance evaluations we conduct, they really look at how is the project or the activity being implemented. both from the technical angle or from the management angle, and make decisions as we go along. And usually these performance evaluations are sometimes conducted halfway through the activity or towards the end of the activity. Most of our activities, they do span a period of about 5 years. So halfway through, there might be a performance evaluation, and based on the result, there might be some adjustments made to the activity for future, continuing the project forward. Next slide, please. Yeah, we conduct on average between 125 and 150 evaluations annually, and we have an evaluation registry where all evaluations that missions are conducting are registered. So we know when the evaluations are planned, when they are ongoing, and when they are completed. And so from this registry, we did a review of about 129 performance evaluations recently, just to get a sense of how these evaluations were being used. And as you can see from the graph, over half of the performance evaluations were used to inform project or activity design. Another half were used to inform management decision-making. And then about 40% were used to get a better understanding of program or project or policy. And then there were like about 16% that were used as opportunity to better engage stakeholders. I'm highlighting that 16% because like one of what we are doing now as an agency is how do we engage the stakeholders that we work with, especially within the context of our current localization, which is a priority of our administration, and the context of equity. So we are beginning to put systems in place to for more stakeholder engagement in our evaluation processes, as well as developing tools that could allow more participation of local experts in our evaluations. Next slide, please. So how do we learn from performance data? USAID does have what we call a collaborating learning and adapting approach to organizational learning. And this includes learning from a variety of evidence, which of course include performance monitoring and evaluation. One example of this CLA process is what's referred to as a pause and reflect. And these are sessions that generate learning, knowledge, and data that contributes to evidence-based decision-making and adaptive management. And one example of a pause and reflect activity is what we call a midterm stock taking, in which missions halfway through the implementation of their strategy will have one of these sessions and bring together all the different data that's been collected throughout the strategy up to that point, and make sense of the data, and based on that, make certain adjustments to adapt the activity based on the evidence that the data is producing. Next slide, please. So to end, what's based on the theme of the webinar, what is working for us right now is that for the use of performance evidence to be effective, USAID have established and institutionalized systems and processes that are applied agency-wide. And then performance evidence itself is an important component in program management, decision-making, and activity design. And performance evidence itself is central to agency learning and adaptive management. So overall, performance evidence is very important at USAID, especially on the performance monitoring side. It's sometimes real-time evidence that are used as the activities are being implemented and decisions made at the moment to make some adjustments to the activity itself. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Winston. That's really interesting. Particularly, I think the data you shared from the registry of performance evaluations, which is a really interesting insight to how the evaluations themselves are then being used to inform decision making. They're not just being undertaken and then sitting in a dusty cupboard somewhere. They're being used to then create a virtuous cycle, which I think is a phrase I've already used. And I think it's something that kind of sums up this subject matter. That's what you want to create. So that's really interesting how the evaluations themselves create more information that informs the ongoing work of the agency. Thank you very much for your contribution. I am now going to ask Christine for her opening comments. And before I do, just another call. We'll be moving into the question and answer portion of our webinar after Christine's presentation. So if you have any questions that have emerged from the presentations so far, then please do submit them. But Christine.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm the evaluation officer for the Department of Commerce. And the Department of Commerce portfolio is extremely diverse. Our bureaus include the Census Bureau, Bureau of Economic Analysis, NOAA, that's the Weather Bureau, as well as an organization that monitors our ocean conditions, climate change, International Trade Administration, Economic Development Administration, Patent Office, Minority Business Development, Economic Development, National Technical Information Administration as well. So very, very diverse. One of the effects of bringing of the Evidence Act, and for that matter, the Government Performance and Results Act, is bringing us together because collectively, we have the expertise of the best consulting firm maybe in the nation. Working in our stovepipes, not quite as good. So we've been pooling our know-how much more than in the past decade, and particularly in the last couple of years with the Evidence Act. And we've needed to do that. We've got a basic dilemma in evaluation and using evidence for decision-making. Good, rigorous evidence can take years to develop. And if you're talking about a random controlled trial with a lot of good design behind it, we're talking typically a couple of years. Decisions need to be made real time, particularly if it's an economic decision, they're trying to come up with some programming to solve a problem, there aren't 2 years to wait. Another dilemma with evaluation is if you're collecting information on impact from your grantees, your stakeholders, the stakeholders that are in most need have the least capability to spend a lot of time and resources on sending you information. So your information gathering can actually exclude the populations you most want to reach. So timeliness is a problem and burden is a problem. Now our solution, which I will admit right now is still more aspirational than right there, but we're hoping it's close, is to use our own statistical and administrative information more, better for the purposes of monitoring whether a project is having the impact that we had hoped for. Right now in a lot of our projects, if you look at a project where we're trying to create jobs through some kind of community intervention, for the first couple of years, typically we're looking at projections, not real information, what's happening down in the trenches. Now, one of the things that's helping us along is the creation of these different indices that tell us what's so about community, and there's many of them. The Census Bureau has the Opportunity Atlas, which is based on Raj Chetty's work at Harvard and tells us about small areas of the United States that have had generational lack of opportunity. There's county health rankings out of the University of Wisconsin. Our own Economic Development Administration in Argonne has worked on a national economic resilience data estimator. All of them give us some idea about where different parts of the country at a fairly granular level, where are they at right now in terms of economic resilience, opportunity, access to health care. Even in the case of there's social vulnerability indexes and also environmental justice indexes. But the one that I would say is most promising for the purpose of evaluation is called I'll give you the exact title, and I will put it in the chat, the Community Resilience Estimate for Equity. And it's from the Census Bureau, and it's a product of collaboration between the Census Bureau and the Economic Development Administration. So Economic Development Administration, or EDA, they have had a considerable amount of funds from the American Rescue Program to help communities recover from the quarantine and COVID and all the economic implications. Now, the Community Resilience Estimates for Equity gives you data right down to the census tract level. That's key. An awful lot of economic development interventions don't have much impact at a county level. They're projects that will help a community, but you won't necessarily see the impact at a county level. So we need data that shows, one, where is that county before the intervention? And yes, where will it be after the intervention? Now, as instruments like that are refined, our ability to track the delta, where were they at the tract level before the intervention, and where were they at the tract level after the intervention, pose a way of looking at progress and impact without having a big burden, and getting the information perhaps a bit more real time than we have in the past. Even if the information were annually updated, we could improve on most evaluation models in terms of the lag time from implementation to information on impact. Now, the fly in the ointment is we don't know, we can't use this approach for attribution. So I can see if a census tract is progressing. Can I necessarily attribute it to the commerce intervention? And the answer is not necessarily, but it's still a great advance, because what we're also hoping to do is to get the federal government writ large recording in their program information what census tracts will benefit from the intervention. In many cases, we have recorded where the applicant is, but the applicant is not necessarily the place targeted for the benefit. So we're hoping across the board to have all our programming include information on the benefiting tracts. Now with that, I could ideally, in our aspiration, go to a map, click on a census tract, see the investment there at the federal level, and then also see the delta from some indicators on how that area is doing. Now, again, aspiration, we're working on it, but the ability to solve the problem, both of having more current information and information that does not put a big burden on the community, the potential is great. As you might expect, a stumbling block is making sure we do all that with the proper privacy protections in place. So that's at the focus of our look at how to accomplish this. Now, we also know that privacy protection technology is advancing rapidly. So it could be that what's a dilemma right now won't be in a couple of years, but we are looking for short-term ways of using this information, particularly on the new infrastructure program, which is very extensive, to be able to see the economic impact of that on small places and small populations. Now, another consideration, and a big consideration for the Biden administration, is are these benefits getting to the underserved, to populations that historically haven't gotten the full benefit of the American dream? And again, we can turn to our own Census Bureau to get information on that. Some of these indices will certainly identify those underserved populations. We can earmark those places and have set some targets for particularly reaching those places with our benefits, with our programming. And we can also look at whether the actual impacts are occurring in those communities. It's one thing to put out dollars, it's another thing to actually accomplish the impact that you're trying to achieve. Underpinning all this as we move forward is commerce has really been in the eye of the tornado in terms of being charged by the administration with dealing with some very immediate and significant missions, right? Commerce is very much involved, obviously, with recovery, but it's also very much through NOAA involved with climate resilience. We have a big role in securing the supply chain and expanding the domestic supply chain for technology. So a lot of programming has been developed, and it's been developed in the past couple of years, and will be implemented or is in the process of being implemented. So how do we bring evidence to all that? Well, we've got the advantage in those areas of a good library of evidence on what's worked in the past, but we want that information to be as much in the dialogue, the discussion, the frontal memory of the decision makers. So we'll be upping our game in terms of creating internal briefings on important research findings that have occurred and how it might apply to the policy decisions coming to us. I mean, where the rubber hits the road is when people are working with staffers on the Hill in terms of program design, and you haven't got time to pull out a research paper when you're being pressured to help develop a whole new program. So we need that information very much available to and accessible to and expressed in plain language to our decision makers and the folks in the Hill and in the bureaucracy. So I think it's off to the panel discussion. Am I right about that?
Yes, indeed, Christine, and thank you very much for that. Really interesting idea on kind of using more real-time data and how to quicken perhaps an understanding of what's working and what isn't, and that your closing comments there that kind of link back to what Annie was saying about providing the evidence, getting the evidence in front of decision makers, and not just public service and civil service decision makers, but the people, the legislators and politicians on the Hill as well, who are involved in crafting these policies too. That's a really good point, and perhaps one that we can explore in the questions. We are getting a number of questions in. Thank you very much to everybody who's putting them in. Carlos Carpi is our most prestigious questioner so far. Carlos, I might use my chair's prerogative to group a couple of your questions together, if that is okay. But before I do that, I want to use my chair's prerogative further to ask everybody to kind of evaluate your own organization's evaluation, as it were, and we'll go around the panel in the order that they spoke in the opening comments. I'm just wondering where you think your organization is in its own evaluation, and perhaps added to that, it would be interesting to get some reflections on what impact the Evidence Act has had. Has it been a game changer in terms of agencies looking to do this evaluation, or was it a kind of formalization of work that was already ongoing? I'll perhaps ask Annie to speak first to that.
Great, thank you, Richard. I think to the assessment, and being honest here too, I think Treasury is at our beginning stages in maturity and trying to evaluate and do that evidence building. It's not to say that we have never done evidence based work. A lot of our decision making is evidence based, though I think with the Foundation of Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, it does allow us to be more thoughtful, I would say, and have a coordination of understanding what information is out there, and at least baselining our a lot of good work that's already been done that has maybe not been elevated. And so that is a very big positive on our end, understanding how to implement the law. And then, yeah, and I think we still expose, I would say, some of the challenges that were ahead, and we're really excited to think about using the data sharing and understanding how to make more robust structures for that to shine. So I would maybe have those are my reflections on that.
Great, thanks very much. Jason, do you want to share your thoughts?
Yeah, I think for us at the Small Business Administration, we had proceeded for a few years before the Evidence Act passed. I think for us, the structures in place, we are facilitating many discussions with our program offices to advance evidence-based decision making. And I think for us, the next evolution is continuing to retrieve quality data and improve really the timeliness of decision making. But I think for us, we made some good inroads, and with the Evidence Act to continue to strengthen those processes.
Kathleen, perhaps your reflection on the agencies you work with and your time in government too.
Yeah, I have a bit of a different perspective as I'm not currently employed by any agency, but from my perspective, there's just such a wide level of maturities in using data for policy. Many did before the act, like USAID, but then the act clearly put a lot of pressure and spurred a lot of innovation very quickly. I saw that across many agencies. I think the assignment of the CDOs, which came out of that Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, was really critical because it allows that one point to kind of see across the enterprise and see where you can consolidate different projects and direct challenges so that there's not just a ton of different ideas and research going on, but it can be kind of more focused and you're making sure you're spending your money appropriately.
Winston, yeah, I think we've heard that USAID was kind of a trailblazer in this area. Has it been affected by the Evidence Act?
Oh yeah, as already mentioned, we had an evaluation policy in 2011, and we also had an agency learning agenda, which we just revised, given that we have a new administration, and so there are new priorities and new questions that we're looking at. So it's been very effective. The Evidence Act actually has resulted in a process of awareness and has brought on board leadership, because in terms of evaluation effectiveness, evaluation use, having the leadership buy-in is very important. So with the Evidence Act, what it has done is leadership is aware of evaluations, the importance, the importance of evidence. And it's also, the Evidence Act kind of provide opportunities for us to go beyond, what we've traditionally done. So part of that involves how do we share our evaluations more broadly. So we've established an evaluation dashboard that does have all the completed evaluations from 2016. We now working on developing kind of a newsletter, which we're calling From Evidence to Action, where we'll be highlighting how these evaluations were used, but more so that other missions can learn from each other, because that's one of the areas that people. You do an evaluation in Ghana, they want to do a similar one in Haiti. Now they can at least get to a sense of what's going on. In terms of challenge, I would say the main challenge we have and where we're working is how do we make especially the performance evaluations more rigorous? How do we continue to strengthen the evaluation methods themselves to be a little more rigorous so that we get better quality data as we conduct these evaluations? That's
great. And Christine, do you have any reflections?
Sure. I think the Evidence Act has been a great asset to the Department of Commerce. It's given us the opportunity to showcase where we've long been strong. Our scientific and statistical agencies are totally evidence-based, be it the National Institute of Standards, NOAA, Census Bureau, BEA. But it's also given us impetus to take that wonderful data resource and use it to up our game in our social service agencies like the Economic Development Administration, International Trade Administration, Minority Business Administration. So we can show off a bit in some areas and then also use the visibility to get more support for using our wonderful data for our social service agencies.
Great. And I'm going to take some of Carlos's questions now, just to pick a couple of these. And please do, if anyone else has questions, send them in. One I think that's worth touching on is kind of setting a baseline for a project. When you're developing these plans, how difficult is it to know where you're starting from to make sure that you're measuring what actually changes? Perhaps I'll ask Jason that first, because I thought the climate loans example that you mentioned, Jason, was an interesting one. Is that a new project, so you know where you're starting from, or is that something that is kind of already underway?
So we did have a starting point for it, but I think it's a valid question because sometimes it is difficult to know where you are establishing your baseline. And I think part of it's feeling it out, working with the program managers to determine, first off, where you have data. That's really the first question that we've used, and really trying to determine where should your policy intervention be. I think it's important to establish a baseline. I think sometimes it's often forgotten or not looked at, but that's one of the first considerations that should be taken into account.
Winston, if I can come to you next on that, and then anybody who wants to raise their hand. I imagine it can be more difficult establishing that baseline for the projects that USAID has out in the field.
Well, it depends. Like I mentioned, the performance management plan, and these indicators that we collect, that we track in the performance monitoring, we do establish baselines for those indicators. And in some cases, we do household surveys, community surveys to establish the baseline. In some activities, like the Feed the Future, for example, food security activity, they do have a system where they have what they call the zone of influence. That is the boundary where they expect to make a difference. And in that zone of influence, they do surveys where they can collect the baseline to establish their starting point and then track, how that whatever the indicator is changing over time. So yeah, we do have, and then sometimes, depending on the complexity of the situation, they might use secondary data to establish the baseline. But we always try to establish a baseline for each of the indicators that we do track.
Mm-hmm. And we have another question here. Is failure quantifiable? Can you use the evaluation, and should use the evaluation, and how quickly should you use the evaluation to say this isn't working, we've got to stop, and either go back to first principles or stop the project entirely? Annie, I've not come to you in a wee while. Do you have any thoughts on that? And then anybody else who wants to raise their hand, please do.
Yeah, Richard, I could go, because I think there's some interesting conversations about rapid evaluations that could be handled in midpoint to see, are we making our intended outcomes, and are there course corrections that we could do? I think some of those are at varying levels of appetite, because if you think about, just thinking the pandemic relief on the US end as an example, we did get a lot of direction from Congress to be able to support the American people and sending out basically financial money to different communities, and balancing, I would say, implementing the program and then doing a midpoint evaluation to ensure that that's actually being done correctly. We have to understand trade-offs between having to have a third party coming in or even internal to even do that process. I think some of it's a lot more applicable. We are at the end when you do a end of evaluation. And then I would say, like, the perfect scenario in essence would be that before the program is actually implemented, there should be some sort of evaluation design laid out, so that as you're implementing the program, you are collecting information that is ultimately going to be used for an evaluation at the end. So I feel like that's the three types of evaluation methodologies that we ponder about as we're looking into implementation of a program. All very valid, all very useful with pros and cons.
Christine, do you have any thoughts on kind of identifying things that haven't worked and when you do it?
Yeah, important observation is, I think, one of the downfalls of evaluation over the decades. It's been tried to, politically, it's been used to say this program is altogether bad, a failure, or altogether good. And that's rarely the case. It is occasionally the case. I think we all agree that the the DARE program, kind of scared straight, was not what we had hoped it to be. So occasionally we have a total loser. But most of the time, the programming is, the question is, under what circumstances is the program collectively successful? What's the secret sauce under different conditions? So the emphasis now, I think so appropriately, is on not so much as a whole program approach, good or bad, but what makes it work better? Or if a particular project fails, what was the critical factor that caused that to happen? So as we use the program in other places, either similar or different, we avoid that mistake. So the emphasis should be on learning. And I think for the most part is with this generation of evaluation.
Great, thanks very much. I think Kathleen wants to come in on that point too.
Yeah, and I want to echo what Christine said about it's about learning, right? The failure should always be about learning. But I also have seen, some agencies invest in this new policy or program, and there's a lot of hype around it. There's a lot of money into it, and at some point, people realize this isn't working. And I think it's okay to say this isn't working and learn from that, instead of continuing to invest in it when we really know it's not. So I think that is okay. And like Christine said, we should just learn from it and pivot.
And we also have a question. I'll put this to Kathleen in the first instance, and then anyone else can join in, about automation. We're talking a lot about data here and how it's best used. Can we use automation, use AI, make greater use of technology to kind of unlock these insights and make them more actionable?
Yeah, and there's a lot of hype around automation. It's a buzzword right now, and it can be very valuable. I think it's important that, it should always augment people, not replace people, right? So automation should be used for tasks that are very repetitive and very manual, so that we can free up our employees to focus on things that are more meaningful, so that they can instead focus on, taking that highly technical information and then putting it in a consumable format for policymakers, right? That's what I think that automation should be used for, and I do believe it should be used more.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on the kind of technology side? Because this is a lot of data. Are there insights there in the data that we are currently not unlocking, and how could we do that?
I can just mention it's an area that we are exploring. Most recently, we had to do an equity assessment, which is part of responding to a White House Equity Act, that executive order. And so we had to, comb through a lot of our reports to determine the extent to which marginalized populations were part of our programming. And we worked with contractor who developed some algorithm and AI to go through these reports. And so that's one area that we're exploring, and also the development. The Chief Data Officer, Shaw, does have an activity they call the Development Data Commons, which is bringing together a broad range of data to start analyzing it through automation. So it's a work that's just starting out at USAID.
Great, thank you very much. Does anybody want to come in on that point? Otherwise, I fear that we will have to bring the webinar to an end. We've heard a lot of fascinating things today. I've really enjoyed the session. Thanks very much to our panel for joining us, and for everybody watching along. You'll be receiving a recording of the session when it is available in the next few days, and also a report of the webinar in the next few weeks too. Before that though, there is a survey that should be in your inbox now to give us your thoughts on today's webinar, and it would really help me and the team here at Global Government Forum if you were able to complete that, to help us make sure we are providing the best possible content. And any ideas on topics you would like to see us cover in our future webinars would also be welcome. That would make my job a lot easier. So thanks again, everybody, for joining, and thanks to SAS for being our knowledge partner in this webinar. We do hope to see you at another one of our webinars soon. You can see details of one of our upcoming webinars, Adopting to Increase Risk, Cyber and Data Security in the Age of Uncertainty, on the 22nd of June. And my colleagues have shared the registration link for that in the chat. So it would be great to see you at that event, or indeed any other Global Government Forum event. So thank you again, everybody, for attending today, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.